Hello, everybody. Welcome to Writer's Lunch. It's good to see you all here. You all know me, Anna. I've been doing Writer's Lunch for a couple of years now with Shannon and Sean and Daphne, Ian, and I'm going to be talking about world building specifically on the page when you're writing. I know I've talked about world building before, kind of more generally in a, conceptual, like pre-writing kind of way. This is going to be world building as you're writing. How do you get all of that stuff, all of that information that you have come up with about your world? How do you get that on the page for the reader in an interesting and engaging way? So first, a little about me. You all know me. I'm a sci-fi fantasy author. I'm an editor at Tomeworks. I'm querying my first novel, which if anyone has ever queried literary agents before, you know it's a long process with lots of waiting around. So I'm working on that. All right, so why do we care about world building? For science fiction and fantasy writers, I think this question is pretty evident. World building is kind of, the bread and butter of science fiction and fantasy. This is kind of, what you have if you're writing science fiction or fantasy. World building is kind of what you have to start with in order to, give your characters and your plot a setting. But it's also important for other genres. I would argue that every genre of writing, whether you're doing literary fiction, horror, romance, even memoir to some extent requires world building. The minimal amount of world building, which is like a setting where things happen in, you have to have a strong idea or a strong, vision of where your characters are and this area or this setting that they're in, especially if you're writing like contemporary fiction or memoir, or historical fiction. Your world building has to be like accurate. If you're writing a story that takes place in, I don't know, Portland, Oregon, you have to do research and know about Portland, Oregon, so you can accurately portray, or at least, to some extent accurately portray this city on the page. So world building is important no matter what you're writing, but most of it happens behind the scenes. So you're doing world building before you're actually writing the book. Whether you're inventing a world for sci-fi fantasy or whether you're doing research about the real world for, contemporary fiction or whatever, this is all happening before you start writing the book. In most cases, sometimes people start writing before they start world building, but it's happening kind of before you get that book finished.
Can I interrupt you for some fun
Yeah, go
world
ahead.
building? Okay, so one of the things that I had written was a novel about vampires, and I did a ton of research. You said Portland, Oregon, which is why this is funny to me. But back in the 20 teens, there was a sex club associated with Ron Jeremy, and I put one of my victim scenes inside of it, and I was so proud of myself for all the world building stuff that I did. It took me a couple of years to write that book, and by the end of it, the club had closed down.
No.
So just FYI, even if you're doing something that is supposed to be set in the contemporary world, you may still have to continue your world building even after you write the scenes to make sure things have not changed significantly.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So to
Um,
petition about
so,
world building something that's not even sci-fi or speculative or anything.
mhm.
I was writing a cozy mystery set in Branson, Missouri, and that story I obviously struggle with having stories kind of taking place in floating settings, not describing my settings very well, and that story didn't really even fully form into a way it could be written until I decided where I was going to set it, and everything past that just kind of fell into place.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes the world building kind of informs the story, right? It's like, and it really depends on what you're writing. Because like I know for me, sometimes the world building comes first, but sometimes the plot comes first. And, it really just depends on, a particular story. But so looking at the chat, Russell asks, how about a world where every night a plague of flying drones terrorize the citizens? Yeah, you have to think about, okay, where are these drones coming from? Where do the citizens live? How do they hide from the drones? What kind of buildings do they have or, protections do they have to help them either hide or, get away? So these are like world building setting things that you have to kind of think about. And Daphne said Percy Jackson very famously misrepresented the St. Louis Gateway Arch. Yeah, I think Wasn't it in the book? It's represented as being across the river, but it's
Yeah,
not in real life.
it's not across the river, and it's definitely not something that you can fall into the river from.
Right.
He retconned it later on. I think they republished the book and he fixed it.
Yeah. So, do your research. If you're writing a book that takes place in a real life city, do your research before you finish it. But so we talked about why world building is important, why we have to do it. But getting it on the page can be kind of tricky because it's easy to fall into long paragraphs of exposition where you're explaining your world to the reader, where you're taking like long breaks in the plot to really describe something in great detail or, explain why this aspect of the world works the way it does. And that if you're doing that, long sections of exposition you can lose the reader's interest. And so you want to kind of avoid that. So we're going to talk about how to get the important world building details that your reader needs to understand your story, how to get those on the page without long exposition breaks. So first, let's talk about kind of the differences between, or like recognizing, world building versus exposition. So world building has certain objectives, right? It provides context for the story. The reader has to have some understanding of the world that the story takes place in order to understand the characters and the plot. It also serves as set dressing, so it makes the background to the plot, it makes it interesting. And it also establishes rules for the characters to either operate within or to break. So I included this image, and I think this is a good example of kind of world building. This is a video game. This is a video game I like a lot. But basically, the character is trying to get into this city, and you're told you can't go in here. There's no voe allowed. The game does not explain to you what a voe is. It provides context. Here, clearly you are a voe. You're not being allowed into this city. It's not telling you what a voe is, but it is presenting this information in a context that lets you develop an understanding for what it is as you play the game. And part of the game's objective is figuring out how to get into this city even though you are not allowed in. So, this is trying to figure out how to break these rules that the world building is establishing. So these are kind of like my top 5 tips for world building when you're writing. So not everything that you create behind the scenes is going to make it onto the page. And that is okay, especially if you're doing world building for sci-fi or fantasy. You're inventing this really big, expansive world with a lot of details. There's no way all of that is going to be relevant to the story that you're writing, and there's no way that it's all going to end up on the page. Don't worry about that. Don't even try to get all of your world building on the page. Focus on what is relevant for the story that you're writing and for the characters that populate your story, and save the rest. Don't throw it away. Keep it in a Word document somewhere. You could always use it for a later story set in the same world, or, as a lot of, especially like science fiction fantasy authors like to do appendices. It has more information about the world building than was actually in the book. So you could keep it for appendices. You could keep it for, really anything. So don't throw it away, but don't worry if it's not making it into your book. And you're like, oh my God, I spent, 5 hours figuring out, that these, figuring out what kind of animals populate this specific area. And my book isn't even, none of my characters even go here. Don't worry about it. It's fine. It was 5 hours of your time, but it's, 5 hours of time that you were learning about this world that you're inventing. And that's valuable, even if it doesn't make it into your final book. Let the chicken exist or don't, depending on your philosophy. What this means, essentially, Keep things in your book, especially science fiction and fantasy. Don't make everything brand new to the reader. So if you don't have to spend the time or the words introducing a creature that takes the same kind of place as a chicken in terms of livestock, then you can spend your words on something that's going to be more engaging to the reader. You can just allow chickens to exist in your fantasy world, and that frees you up to spend time in your book on more interesting things. Some authors don't prefer this approach, and that's okay. They make everything kind of brand new. So in some fantasy worlds, you'll have a creature that is introduced that fits the same livestock niche as a chicken does, but it's, something else entirely. And you have to introduce that in the context of your story and be really careful to avoid exposition while you're doing that if it's relevant. Consider interactions between your characters and the world. So how, depending on, where your character fits within this world, how do they interact with the rules and the setting that you have established? And you have to really think about that in terms of like, what is a character going to notice in any particular scene? What parts of the world is this character going to understand versus what aren't they going to understand? And what parts of this world is a character going to like or try to fight against? Also, use world building to breed conflict. This is how, you can get your world building be really relevant to your plot. Is if you make it central to the plot. Some aspect of the world building is central to your main conflict, and it kind of drives the characters through the story. That kind of can help you get more of it on the page without being too exposition-y. Also, the most important tip that I have for world building is don't let it get in the way of your story. If you've established all these rules, before you started writing, you've established, your setting and the world and all the rules of the world, and then you start writing and you're like, oh, well, the character can't do this because I said that, this is against the rules of magic or, whatever in this world. Don't let that get in the way of your story. You can always change the rules however fits your story best, as long as you remain internally consistent and, logical in your world building. Then, don't feel like you're constrained by whatever rules you developed before you started writing. All right. But when you're trying to get your world building on the page, you will run into what I like to call the exposition paradox. So, as we established, the reader needs to understand your world, and the instinct that you have might be to explain it. But if you take the time, if you stop what you're doing, you stop the plot, you stop the characters to explain some concept about your world, that slows your entire book down. That kind of like the action will just grind to a halt. It can also be dry and boring. Reader interest kind of, you don't want a reader skating over your world building, especially if you're presenting world building details that are important to the story. You don't want to present them in such a way that the reader is going to just gloss over them. So I'm going to give you advice that we have actually railed against before, but it's okay because I'm going to explain to you how to do this. So fight the instinct to explain your world and instead show, don't tell. But it's okay. I'm going to explain how to do it. I'm not just going to tell you show, don't tell and leave you with that.
Don't worry, Ian's not here to have a conniption.
Well, and I do agree with him. It's like people say show, don't tell, but then they don't explain to you what that means. But I'm going to explain what that means, so it's okay. So at this point, before we get into that, does anyone have any questions? Okay, I will take that as a no, and we will get into that. All right, so we're going to talk about incluing. And if you've never heard this word, that's fine, because I had never heard it either until last year. So we're going to talk about incluing and what it means. Incluing is the hotter sibling of the info dump. Incluing is what is like indirect exposition. This is a method of weaving your world building details into and around the plot, which helps keep the readers engaged because you can present world building details while the plot is happening at the same time. And so you're still driving that action forward, but you're getting the important world building information presented to your readers. So if you don't really understand that, I'm going to give you an example. So we're going to start with an example of writing that is exposition-y. So if someone would like to read this for me, that would be great. If not, I can read it. So if you want to read it, just mute and start reading. Okay, I'll read it. All right. The man paced through the market stalls. Like all the people of this world, his body was covered in a thick coat of feathers. His were vibrant crimson, an uncommon color. Bony pinions sprouted from the outside edge of his hand and sported long flight feathers. These he kept tucked up against his forearm when not in use. His face alone was bare of feathers, and his features were a strange mixture of human and avian. No shoes covered his clawed feet. He stopped at a stall and smiled at the shopkeeper. Her feathers were gold, and ruffled around her face as she smiled back. Morning, he said. So by itself, this isn't terrible. It's a long block of description, of exposition about this character. And read by itself, it's not horrible, But if you have a whole book full of stuff like this, where you start the action and then you take like 5 sentences to get back to the action, it's going to become very repetitive and, kind of feel the reading it is going to feel very dense and hard to get through. So I have rewritten this with using incluing. And so now we're going to look at that example. Would anyone like to read this?
I'll read it.
Okay.
The man paced through the market stalls, his crimson feathers glimmering in the morning sun. Spotting a shopkeeper he knew, he raised a hand, taking care to keep his pinion folded tight against his forearm so as to not bump into anything. Morning, he called. The shopkeeper looked up from her wares. She smiled, the expression ruffling the golden feathers that framed her face. Morning, what are you looking for today? Anything in particular? The man scratched the cobblestones with one clawed foot. I heard you have some rare jewelry from far away. It's my wife's birthday tomorrow. I'd love to surprise her. I see. The shopkeeper bent to rummage behind her counter. When she straightened, something glittered in her hands. I have just the thing.
Thanks, Shannon. So with this example, you can kind of see we're getting all of the same details about this character. We're still getting that they're feathered. We're still getting that he has pinions that fold up against his forearm. We're still getting that he has clawed feet, that he's not wearing shoes. And we're still getting that these characters don't have beaks and that the feathers kind of frame their face instead of covering their whole face. So we're still getting all the same details, but we're getting them as plot is happening. So we don't pause in the action to spend time explaining these details. We just keep on going and weave the details in as we go. That is incluing, and that is minimizing exposition, minimizing those breaks, long breaks in the action for explaining or for description to kind of keep your momentum as you get world building details woven in there. Because with this example, you can still get like the same idea of what the character looks like as you did with the first example, but you get that as he's moving through the plot. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have questions about this? Okay. All right. So some tips for using incluing in your writing. Excuse me. You can use dialogue to help impart information. You do have to be careful with dialogue because it can very quickly descend into a, as you know, blah, 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 blah. As you know, such and such thing is important in our world and blah, blah, blah. You don't really want to descend into that. And if you want an example of this in fiction, popular fiction that has been published recently, Fourth Wing does this a lot at the beginning. And I almost couldn't read it because of that. It was really bad. So you have to kind of watch out if you're using dialogue to kind of impart world building information to the reader, because you have to consider like that if a character is explaining something to another character, you have to kind of consider like, would this character, like living in this world, would they already have an understanding of this? Like, is this something that they should logically need explained to them? You can use flashbacks to kind of impart more world.
One more thing about the dialogue.
Yeah, go ahead, Daphne.
About dialogue and about making sure it's something your characters would actually say. So in the United States, salt and pepper go really well together. There's the understanding of like, you see a recipe and it says S&P, you know that's salt and pepper. At some point in recent ancient history, there was a third condiment and no one knows what it was, because in all of the records, no one would say what it was because it was assumed you would know it. And so you have to know if there's things like that your characters simply aren't going to say, because of course everybody knows this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So yeah, those are things that you have to think about. When you're getting that world building on the page, is like, would this character already know this? Does it make sense for them to know this? Does it make sense for them to not know this, having, given as they live in this world? You can also use flashbacks to impart more world building information, but careful not to do too many, because a lot of flashbacks just kind of stalls the plot and, the readers are waiting for the plot to move forward. So you have to be kind of judicious about how you use flashbacks to impart world building information. Backstory narration you can use to which kind of fits in with flashbacks, talking about a character's backstory, in the context of what's happening in the plot, their backstory kind of comes up, or like they reveal some sort of trauma, based on what's happening in the plot. But you have to kind of be careful of exposition creeping into this, or you just stop and explain, Timmy is afraid of spiders because when he was a kid, blah, 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 blah. So, you have to kind of be careful about that. Inner monologue, you have to kind of be careful with inner monologue because if you're using like a really close POV, you can get a lot of inner monologue, but this can kind of become, and Shannon mentioned this in the chat about dialogue and inner monologue. It kind of creates the same problem as exposition where it gets boring. It gets kind of dry. It gets hard to read through. Another thing you have to worry about with inner monologue is head hopping, where you're, especially if you're doing a close POV, where you're revealing the inner thoughts of multiple characters at once. But yeah, if you are writing something and you have a lot of words, a lot of your time on the page that is spent in the character's head, that can become dense and hard for a reader to get through. They need to be outside of their head more than inside. But the inner monologue can help you to reveal world building details as well. And then background details. Think about, whenever your characters are in a place, what does that place look like? How does that place fit into the world? What things are there, if you're writing contemporary fiction, if you're writing a story in Portland, what street are they on? What buildings can they see? What businesses, are around? If you're writing a fantasy, same kind of thing. It's like, whenever they go to a city, what is the city like? What are the people in there like? And think about what of those background details your characters would notice as they're moving through the scene. And we're going to talk about that a little bit next. But so this is just some tips for how to like use incluing to get your world building across to the reader. But with all of these, you do have to kind of be careful about descending back into exposition, stalling out the plot. You want to keep the plot. The main thing is to keep the plot moving forward, keep the readers engaged. So just weaving in those details as the plot goes and not really pausing too much to get your world building in. So does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions at this point or comments? Okay, cool. All right, so effective descriptions. So I mentioned on the previous slide, you want to kind of consider what your character is going to notice about the background of whatever location they're in. So we're going to kind of talk about how to make your descriptions more effective because I love descriptive writing. I really do. But I really love like my worlds to feel, lush and lived in and, to kind of feel immersive for the reader. But there's a balance that you have to strike in order to keep the reader engaged in your story. So we're going to talk about a little bit about how to do that. So like I said, balance is important. You can have too much of a good thing. So when you're wanting to describe a scene, a new location, you're wanting to include some background details in your character's inner monologue as they're going through a scene, whatever, you need to think about what descriptive details are actually relevant to the story. And there's going to be more detail in any scene than relevant. It's the same thing as like, with world building in general. There's going to be more there than is going to make it onto the page. And that's okay. You don't want everything to be on the page because that gets overwhelming to read. You just want the things that are relevant or things that the point of view character would notice. So think about, your character and who they are and what their personality is like. And when they're, in a library or when they're standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking, a vast plain, like in this little GIF that I have, what would they notice as they're looking out on the landscape around them? What are the things that would stand out to your character specifically? And so that's a good way those are some things just to think about to help your descriptions when you're describing a scene be more effective and also, not bog down the reader. So here's an example of some over description. And you see, so I feel like I see this a lot with characters. When someone is introducing a character, they want to describe every aspect of that character's appearance. And so that's why this example centers on a character. So would anyone like to read this for me?
I'll do it.
Okay.
David was beautiful. Soft, dark curls framed his face. His eyes were green like the greenest grass, shining in the morning light streaming through the windows. His arms were muscular, but not overly so. Not quite so much that his biceps strained the fabric of his white t-shirt. His skin was tanned, like he'd spent a week basking on some remote beach. There was a shadow of stubble on his chin that hadn't been there yesterday. An easy smile played at his lips, as always. His cyan apron was stained with smears of chocolate and jam, and the fabric collecting crumbs from the pastries he'd been serving all morning. Finally, he finished the espresso he was making and turned to me. I found I couldn't quite meet his green eyes with my own.
Thanks, Daphne. So this is what I would describe as over description. Again, I like with the first example, by itself, it's not terrible. But if you're reading a book where every character that's introduced is described in this much detail, it's going to get kind of dense.
This is something that fan fiction authors fall into a lot of the time, and they do it
Yeah.
especially with clothes, over describing people's clothes. And so something like this, right? This would be perfectly valid in a romance if
hmm
he is your main guy, but don't do this to everyone. Do this once. Do this
Yeah,
once with
just
him.
one time. One time is fine. Yeah, like yeah, it's not a terrible description by itself. But, like if every character was being described this way, the book would get hard to read after a little while.
I want to harp on a point that I mean
Yeah.
you pretty much already made. Like when you spend a lot of time describing something, you are keying into the reader. This is important.
Yeah.
So if you do that with everything, the reader does not know what to take as this is important and what
Yeah.
is simply background. And so
And
they
that
get
goes
exhausted because they're looking for like what the important stuff is, and you've given them nothing to kind of hold on to as what's important. It's just like, oh, everything's important, then nothing is important.
Yeah.
But also, to Anna's point, you can include things that aren't important because you don't want the reader to assume everything is a Chekhov's gun, right? You can't have every gun be a Chekhov's gun.
Right.
So you have to kind of balance it. Like she keeps saying this, she keeps saying is like you can't do it too much, and that is really the rule overall. Is each of
Yeah.
these things is good in moderation, so do all of them in moderation.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Balance.
it's like you need to do it with intent. Like you
Yeah.
can definitely have places with much more description or with description that is just holding space for a pause. But just be aware, if you are going to put so much detail into something that it needs to be something that's important because you're communicating to the reader that it's important.
Yeah. 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 Balance is very important. Maybe we should have a writer's lunch about balance because it's not just important for world building. It's important for dialogue, for the narration that happens in between the dialogue. It's important for tension. It's balance. It's important for everything. But so you can also see in this example that again, while we're describing this character, the plot doesn't go anywhere. It's the description starts and we don't even know that he's making espresso until we get to the very end. We don't even know that he's working in presumably a cafe until we get to the last sentence of that first paragraph where he's wearing an apron that has pastry crumbs on it. So, the plot is taking a pause for us to really get a good look at this character, and we're not moving it forward. So I have rewritten this example as well with being more judicious with the description. So would anyone like to read this for me? If not, I can read it.
Daphne's not going to go into it because I think she probably loves this stuff since romance is her wheelhouse, but I'll read it.
Okay.
David was beautiful. I watched as he ran the espresso machine, entranced by the ripple of muscles along his tanned forearms. There was a shadow of dark stubble on his chin that hadn't been there yesterday. Feel like sandpaper under my palm? Espresso finished, he wiped his hands on his apron and turned an easy smile in my direction. I found I couldn't quite meet his grass green eyes with my own. Oh. His smile melted. Uncertainty and fear flickered in his face as he glanced around the shop. You can't be here, he said.
Thanks, Shannon. So in this example, there are less descriptive details. We don't get everything. We don't get the eyes shining in the light from the windows or, what else was in the first one? We don't get the color of his apron. We don't get, the white t-shirt. We don't get his hair, so there are certain things in here that we have left out in order to focus more on specific details. So, and as you can see again in this example, the plot is still moving. You get the espresso machine right at the beginning, and then you take a little bit of time to look at him, and then he has finished the espresso and he's, looking at the character, and we're moving forward in this plot very quickly while we're still kind of getting enough description to get a good visual, a good image of this character in our minds. We can get a decent picture of him, but we're just not getting quite every single detail that we did in the first one. He says there is the relationship between the two people now. Yeah, you get that faster because, you know, in the first example, we didn't quite get there. And like, you know, obviously if it had kept going, if I'd had more room on the slide, I would have written more. If we had kept going, we would have gotten there, but it took us longer to get there. In this example, we get there much quicker. And, you know, that is what is keeping the reader engaged in this passage, is like we're getting to this relationship between these two characters a lot quicker than we did before. We're not waiting for it. So does anyone have any questions about this? Does this make sense? Am I like just, you know, not making any sense over here? I don't know. Okay, no one has questions. All right, so we have about a little over 15 minutes left. So we have a writing exercise. You guys are going to get to write a little bit. So what I have done is here is an image, and I would like for y'all to take some time, write a few sentences describing the scene from the point of view of the captain of this airship right here. And, you know, try to incorporate some of the things we've talked about, you know, including, you know, balance in your description, kind of thinking about, you know, what the character would notice or feel is important. Take like 5 minutes to write a few sentences about this, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what everyone has written. Okay, I think it's been about 5 minutes. Would anyone like to share what they wrote? Oh, I see Rhonda's got one in the chat. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it? Okay, I can read it. Okay. Beyond the creak of wood and gargle leather sails, the captain smelled the spring odors of air mint and new soap laid out on windowsills to dry. Winter was leaving his beloved city, the buildings glowing in a rare double sunset. Even the filthy streets below carried a sense of nostalgia, urchins running everywhere, some thieves, and some working their way up to the sky ruled by his family. I like that. I like the Garga leather sails. That's good. You know, that's assuming the Garga is the animal the leather comes from. I do like that because it gives you context. You know, the context it's in, you can assume that a Garga is some sort of animal, but you're not pausing to explain what it is, which I really like. And I like you got smell in there. Smell is one of those senses, and I did a writer's lunch on writing with the senses a while back, and smell is one of those senses that a lot of writers, it kind of falls by the wayside, because I guess, you know, we don't really think about it a lot because, you know, when you're reading, you can't smell what's happening on the page, and so smell, it kind of gets forgotten. So I like that you got smells in there too. Okay, Susan's got one in the chat. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it?
You can read it.
Okay. Docking in Charlemagne Harbor was always treacherous, but the juxtaposition of icy cold and hot smoke from homeless fires made it more so today. I latched my anchor onto Duchess Fiona's balcony, praying that the mooring would hold, and waited for her to skim over in her royal skiff. I like that. I like that. Let's see, you're introducing another character here, the Duchess Fiona, and I like that, you know, presumably this captain and the Duchess know each other. And yeah, let's see, praying that the mooring would hold. Yeah, I like that the captain is doing, you know, kind of captainy things, right? Airship captain things, you know, anchoring the ship onto somewhere, and, you know, thinking about the harbor and how the winds, different densities of air might affect the docking and stuff like that. Yeah, I like that. Good job, y'all. Does anyone have another one that they would like to read or put in the chat or talk about?
I have one.
Okay.
And I don't know if I didn't know if I did all of the instructions right, but this is what I had. The landing tower anchor had been secured. The time to disembark was now, before the tower clock chimes sounded again. Below and above was a large city built for efficiency and a growing population. My hope was to get past the sentry guards before they had time to assemble.
Ooh. Yeah, I like that. I like, you know, we get a little more of the city in yours, and we also get that little bit of intrigue at the end where, this captain must be doing something nefarious, or that the guards would consider to be nefarious if they're worried about getting out of here before the guards assemble. But yeah, I think all of y'all did a great job. I like, some of the details that y'all have kind of woven in, and you're kind of moving the plot forward kind of as you go. Oh, we got another one from Shannon. Shannon, would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay.
Captain Claspy glared at the bridge beyond the skipper, who cowered under his gauge. It was fine as far as bridges go, just a standard overpass for when the storm waters washed through the drainways. Then he rolled his eyes upward to where the other airships floated freely over the spires and rooftops of the crowded city. You bloody forgot to unmoor us before you set sail, you knob. He spit hard and splattered to the ground 40 feet below and gestured back to the ropes holding them to the wall dock. I hope you've got great balance.
I like that. Forgot to unmoor us. Yeah, that's funny.
I was like the thing that I was like, that thing is so far away from their dock.
Yeah, yeah, it is kind of. I didn't even think about that, but that's funny. Yeah, well, very good, everybody. Yeah, I like these examples. You're getting, that little bit of world building in there and moving the plot forward as you go. And the captain is, we're getting a interesting sense. The captain's different in every one of these, so we're getting an interesting sense of what's important to this captain. What they're maybe what they're doing, and, kind of the people that they know. So yeah, I like that. I think that y'all have done a great job with this. So that's all I have. Well, thanks everybody, and I hope to see you next week. Okay, bye.